Welcome back to Vaulted by Proof. This is episode number 5. We have DCInvestor, the very first guest on the Proof podcast. No financial advice, right?
No financial advice or expert opinions.
It's a great honor to have him back. And then we talked to Matt Zhang.
Sorry to spam your social media timeline, but glad to be here.
Founder of Hivemind Capital, a big NFT fund. The three of us talked about AI art versus Gen art, talked about future-proofing your digital art portfolio and their strategies.
Here's an art form that was really reached its potential through public blockchains.
And then lastly, they both have amazing collections, so we went into their vaults.
Those 100-year-old historical streamlamps brought us like a profound sense of like romance and peace.
We looked at one piece from a prior Grail season. I will not spoil the surprise. This was a great show. Let's jump in. Welcome back to Vaulted by Proof. I'm Eli Scheinman, Director of Art at Yuga Labs and Proof. This is a show about collecting and creating digital art. We have a very special episode today. Two of the absolute top collectors in the digital art world. Very excited to dig in. First of all, we have DCInvestor, who not many people know this. DC, you were the very first guest on the Proof podcast way back March 2021. I went and listened to that earlier today. Great to have you here. Really an honor.
Thanks, Eli. I'm excited to be on. And that first episode feels like a lifetime ago. So much has happened since then.
You know, it's funny. The first 20 minutes of that episode was you and Kevin just describing what an NFT is. And so we've come a long way for sure. And then I'm really happy to have Matt Zhang here, who's the founder of Hivemind, $1.5 billion crypto fund, $50 million digital culture fund, doing amazing collecting. Matt, you're all over my Twitter timeline and the sales bots. Great to have you here, Matt.
Sorry to spam your social media timeline, but glad to be here too and share the chat with DC investors and chat about all of it.
I love it. And you guys, you know, it's such an interesting opportunity here to unpack your collecting theses and DC, you know, you were doing so much collecting in the so-called early days. Matt, you've been doing so much collecting recently. And so we have a lot to unpack here. Let's start in the way that we always do with this show, which is actually with something more recently that both of you have collected. Matt, let me start with you. What's one artwork or collection you've recently collected that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I'm actually going to share the screen and just chat a little bit more about something we collected recently and feel pretty excited about. Let me know if you guys can see it. So, you know, we have been a fan for Refik Anadol for a long time. For those in the NFT digital art space, he's a very well-known, talented AI data inspired digital artist. I met him first in mid-2021 before he's creating the Coral, which got shown in Art Basel for the first time. And just very much captivated by his inspirations about the way to transform data and express that in a digital native way. Since then, been following his journey, been talking to him. And, you know, last summer, I think around the same time, he came out with this new collection, Winds of Yawanawa. And, you know, we have been collecting since the Digital Culture Fund has been up and running. And then yesterday, actually, you know, we collected 5 pieces from the collection, which all have the same trait, which is the flower trait, which is in front of you. So if I just very quickly make some of this movement, you can see that, you know, it's a data inspired by the Amazon forest. And then the flower trait is now becoming one of the community's favorite traits. There's only 69 of these traits in the whole collection of 1,000. And now we own 6 of them. And when you actually show them side by side, you know, actually they look just stunning and very distinctive. So a proud sort of collector owning some of these pieces. I would love to spend more time talk about AI, generative art, you know, glitch art, and many other things on the show.
Yeah, beautiful collection. And I saw these come through, I think yesterday or a couple of days ago. So such an interesting group of works there. And just quickly, Matt, back to you. Those come with a print, I think, right? Despite them being animated works. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct. So I think you have about 83 days more to claim the prints. There's a Discord, actually, you can follow some of the details, but yes, definitely encouraging people who actually is a collectors do claim one, because, physically, digital art is just goes differently than viewing on a larger screen, again, versus a small screen.
Sure. Okay, great selection, Matt. And now, DC, over to you. My sense is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that maybe you've been doing a little bit less collecting recently, but I know you have a great selection here. What do you have for us?
Yeah, and I've queued up Harbor Scene by Tyler Hobbs for you all to take a look at today. And I actually just finally got around to unboxing this one today. I received it a couple of weeks ago, but I think it's just a really cool compendium and package that Tyler has put together. And Tyler Hobbs is, of course, a pretty legendary on-chain generative artist behind the set Fidenza. And he's done so many other really interesting things, but I love the idea, before we were talking a little bit about the idea of physical media and how it plays into this genre of NFTs before we went on air. And I think that there's a lot of interesting overlaps and interplays that are still possible and can be explored. But I love how Tyler pulled together this set based on the work by Twakman, who is an impressionist artist back from the 1900s. And I'll pivot the window here to this collection here. But this work is actually in the LACMA collection, and it's an unfinished painting, which also I love the idea of seeing an unfinished painting from that era in a museum setting. And this is something that really inspired Tyler, because it goes on in this narrative here to talk about how his family has like a sailboat, and so he spent a lot of time on the water growing up. And so he created a generative art algorithm to kind of capture the spirit of that, also drawing some notes from Joan Mitchell's work, which is shown here. And so I just love the idea of that mashup. And what he produced was this collection of 3 pieces of art, which kind of, in his mind, capture the spirit of that work. And he released it as a limited edition set. And you can see here it's packaged with the code that was behind the algorithm to create it. So I just love, my collector brain just loves this stuff. And I'm a big fan of Tyler's, obviously. And I was fortunate to get print set number 7 out of 20. So I wanted to share that with everyone today.
I just want to second that from DCInvestor. Actually, the 3 one-of-ones, one of them we actually acquired about a month and a half ago into our digital culture fund. One of them is actually number 2. One of them is actually owned by Tyler himself. And the final one he donated into LACMA as part of the process.
Wow.
So,
Very
we
cool.
actually really, really love the process that he created the work in the first place.
I love this. And I think, DC, one of those tabs you showed was Tyler's website, right? And I love that Tyler goes really deep into all of his works, does the work for his audience to explain the interconnectedness to other works and his process. He's always been so good about that. And I love seeing that example here as well. Great collection. Yeah, DC, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I feel like it's so important for artists to tell some of the story themselves, so that, even for the benefit of the collectors who might be speaking on their behalf about their work, it's always valuable to me to hear what the artist's intent was. And especially for most of the pieces in my collection, I've actually contacted the artist and I've asked them for some of those notes. So the notes that you see in my gallery are mostly sourced directly from commentary from those artists.
Interesting. And DC, quickly, do you have the full set? I think you do, of the LACMA releases to date.
I do. I believe I have all of them. So, which is visible in my gallery at gallery.so/DCInvestor. But I tried to, and I'll probably continue to collect those. But I feel like the partnership with LACMA through Cactoid Labs has been really interesting and has produced a lot of wonderful art.
I love it. Great collection. Cactoid Labs doing great work. And there's a lot of LACMA through lines with Matt, of course, you, and we'll circle back to that towards the end of the show, I think. Okay, let's jump into the meat of the conversation now. And again, you two have both such a good purview of long-term collecting, but also, somewhat different perspectives and angles on your collecting approaches. And so I'm really excited to dig into this. Let's start, DC, with you. When you think about your own collection, over what time horizon are you keeping that in mind? Like, are you a terminal collector, meaning do these artworks, these assets go to your children and your family? Or is there a moment where you look to maybe sell some of these assets? How do you think about that time horizon? Then Matt, we'll come over to you.
Well, first of all, I think that the potential for digital art is immense in the sense of I see digital art as being something which really only increases in importance from here. And I think NFTs are a critical part of that digital art story because it's a medium that allows for true ownership of these digital works. And I think that's something that's super powerful that we as a society still have not really come to grips with. So for me as a collector, and I don't really think of my holdings as a portfolio, I really think of them more as a collection. Every piece that I've added to my collection has been really deliberate. I haven't sold any of the art that I bought since 2021. And that's because, I'm trying to build that collection. Will I hold all of it until my death? Probably not all of it. I mean, I was saying a few weeks ago that I could see myself, if we see a big interest and inflow into the space, maybe I could see myself selling like 5% of my collection in the next several years. But I see the value proposition of digital art really being a multi-decade process, especially as a long-term collector. And so my timeline is literally on decades. Whether some of that will almost certainly extend to my natural lifetime. Some of it will go maybe beyond that. We'll see. But I really have an extreme excitement about the long term of this space as people start to understand digital ownership. And I think we're really on the cusp of that, to be honest.
And DC, just to riff on that for another moment, when you say understand digital ownership, who do you anticipate will better understand that notion and reconstruct those mental models? Is it our contemporaries, or is it sort of this new purchasing power from a younger generation where these are sort of more commonplace mental models and notions? Riff on that for a moment.
I think it's every generation, to be honest. And I think that for the older generations, I think that they, and people like me grew up in the 1980s and 1990s where the concept of digital scarcity simply didn't exist. And actually something being digital inherently meant that it could be replicated an infinite number of times. And so I think that paradigm shift has caught on with people like us who are crypto natives. I think we could say that we're all crypto natives. So we get it, right? We understand the scarcity of Bitcoin, assets like Ether, and of course of NFTs. So for us, it's become second nature. For most people our age, that's not necessarily the case. They don't understand it. I think certainly older generations who might value physical art don't have that same appreciation for digital art. Partially because of the reason that it wasn't ownable in the same way. And there's a whole psychological issue that we could peel back the layers on. But I mean, the idea of something being ownable and that giving it some additional value, both economically, socially, and emotionally is a really complex topic. But I think you hit the nail on the head with the younger generations. I see, when you talk to people who are much younger, right, who are teenagers now, the concept of digital ownership is not something that's foreign to them. They look at things like Fortnite skins, in-game assets, which they don't truly own, but, they do understand concepts like Bitcoin and Ether. And a lot of them actually prefer to be paid for that, for their babysitting duties or whatever. And I think there's some interesting shifts that are going to happen there over time, which we'll only understand in earnest in like 10 years from now.
I love that. And now, Matt, coming over to you, we're talking now about sort of the audience and the net new collector. Of course, as a fund, you're sort of the steward of capital from these LPs and these institutional partners. Talk a little bit both about sort of the composition perhaps of who you're seeing interest from, and then also your time horizons there.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's inevitable as you are a institutional investor. You have different parameters looking and curating the space compared with a personal investor. As a personal investors, you could really go with a lot of different type of, style drift, and you have a bit more relaxed time horizons to hold the pieces you like. For us, given we have a fiduciary duty to not only have a stewardship for the art pieces, but also really trying to do a good job for our investors, there will be different type of limitations. It's about how you approach those limitations and making them not really a shortcoming, but really using them as the way to amplify and bring more capital's adoption to the space. And to us, our fund, we have a 3-year investment period. However, we have a much longer holding period after that, which we think that is sufficient enough for us to give the artwork in our fund enough time, be patient, and then, sort of to divest them if we need to at the right time horizon. That being said, also there's many ways that the institutional investment landscape has developing very, very sophisticatedly that you can continue to hold on to those pieces of works for a much longer period via raising a continuation fund, via working with the artwork in a different way. So I think at this stage, especially for digital art, I would say that the horizon of holding them probably is a lot less of a pain point than people traditionally view this 30, 40, 50 years ago. Because I think the data, the liquidity, the capital, the institutional adoptions, viewing art, digital art as a distinctive asset class has a lot matured and progressed compared with decades ago. So I think from the seats we are in, I think those constraints is no longer a constraint that people normally perceive. On the other side, the ability for us to raise large amount of capital to help the space grow is become a huge advantage for us to leverage on, which we're very excited about to do so.
I love that, Matt. I want to come back to you. Let's talk a little bit about the composition of the Hivemind collection at the moment. From what I understand, it's relatively narrow meaning not that many artists comprise the works in the fund collection at the moment. Talk about your approach to collecting and maybe why you've identified a smaller set of artists to go very deep in their collections.
100%. Again, it's a great question. I think our ethos is two-dimensional. We want to be very open-minded and then scout the landscape as broad as possible. But once we decided to investing and collecting and supporting certain collections and artists, we actually want to be very narrowly focused and go as deep as possible. So these two things actually is not contradicting to each other because the space is very much new space. It's emerging. There's a lot of new technology being tested. There's many new talents that are coming up and doing amazing stuff every other year. So you have to approach the space with a very open-minded approach. There's always going to be new type of digital art being expressed every single year. So we have to do that. On the other side, once you decided certain things is worth doubling down, worth spending the resources and capitals in, I think we have to go very deep because art collecting and art industry as a whole is actually pretty brutal in the sense that the top 10, 20 artists who actually will be immortalized in art history book is actually where most of the value accruing to, right? Like today, I still sort of impressed by a lot of contemporary artists I discover on a weekly and monthly basis, go to a museum and see many amazing artists, but the 20th century contemporary artists, the top 5 or 10 that in the museum that keep going with 20, 30 million sale, they probably can count them with, two hands. So with that sort of like, I guess the landscape where the market is, I think for us, it's very, very important to be disciplined and knowing that actually rather than spreading out your resource because resource and capital is very scarce, to actually really giving the artists a justice of the support they need, we actually need to go very, very deep. That's the reason why we want to starting our fund collecting relatively narrow once we decided which is the ones we really want to support and go with.
I love that. Thanks, Matt. And DC, I think as I mentioned at the very top of the show, you were the first guest on the Proof podcast. I went back and listened, and you had this great approach to your own collecting, which was at that time at least, is the art cool? Is it a cool artist that you want to support, or is it historically significant? Does that still represent the way you think about collecting?
I think it does. And I mean, my point of view, look, if I had more funds, if I had the funds of a fund, I would definitely be collecting even more than I continue to do so. But what I will claim is I'm not paper handing anything that I buy, right? I mean, I've held many of the pieces in my collection I've held from very low valuations up to mania highs. And during the mania, I didn't really accumulate a lot of stuff. I kind of waited for better entries. During the bear market, I accumulated some. But for me, I think the criteria that you mentioned certainly still weigh heavily in my mind. And if anything, since that episode, I probably focused a little bit more on generative art because it really kind of captured my imagination. I think generative art is just a really interesting genre of art, partially because I think especially the nature of on-chain long-form generative art really can't be done through any other mechanism. And so for me, I think that is just hugely powerful. And I think like when you think about the very long term, I think we'll look back and say, here's an art form that was really reached its potential through public blockchains. And I think people still don't necessarily fully understand that right now. But that's why I continue to be kind of an admirer of generative art.
I love that. DC, let me stay with you for a moment. What do you learn, or what did you learn? What can we take forward from sort of 2021 Gen Art so-called bubble into maybe some collecting ideas today around AI? I think AI is sort of the area of the market and the space that has the most energy today. Are there? Well, one, are you an AI art collector, and if not, perhaps why? And then two, are there learnings from 2021 that collectors could keep in mind today? And then Matt, will come over to you.
Sure. I do have a little bit of AI art, and it's mostly some of the earlier kind of GAN generated work by Anne Spalter. And I always thought I liked Anne as an artist and as a curator and as a participant in the space. So I wanted to support her by collecting some of her works. It's not a space that I've dived into a ton, mostly because I'm just so much more interested in generative art. But I think AI art is super interesting. And I think anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that I think AI is absolutely fascinating. And it's really captured my imagination in a way that nothing else since crypto has really captured. I think one of the lessons that we can take from generative art is there was a lot of work and a lot of artists which hit the market during a peak of, we can say, mania hype. And I think people were surprised when valuation wise, a lot of that stuff didn't perform. And I would say it didn't hold its value from that period. And it didn't even hold like 5% of that value, or even 1% in some cases. So I think sometimes exuberance can get a little higher on some of this stuff. But I think that being said, there's definitely going to be some works of the AI genre. They're going to be incredibly valuable by really important creators who, as Matt was saying, will enter the art history books. And it's going to be a small proportion. The same exact thing is true for on-chain generative art as well. And so I think it's incumbent on the collector or for the fund portfolio manager to really think through that and to allocate capital. If you have to think about it from a capital allocation perspective, to allocate it wisely. Because I think someone said to me, well, why would generative art be valuable? You can create an infinite number of generative art. And I was like, well, you can also create an infinite number of physical paintings. And there have been so many paintings created in the course of history, and most of them are forgotten or completely irrelevant. And the same thing is true for digital art, regardless of the genre.
And Matt, of course, at the top of the show, we talked about Refik and your collection there. Maybe, give a perspective on AI art, what you're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, I want to also circle back to what DC was saying earlier. I think generative technology and AI as a tooling to express artist view and art techniques is innocent, right? Technology is neutral. They're not either good or bad. It's like commenting whether pastel, watercolor, or oil painting is good or bad. They're just a way to express the artist's view. I think that's where something to differentiate is, however, the artist and artwork themselves, that can be good and bad from a very subjective way. So I think AI, generative, we're always a big fan for Refik's work. We're also a big supporter, big fan for Tyler's work. So I think we can really compare like for like. And I would say that in either of these fields, and both of these fields, and many other digital native fields like glitch art, like Xcopy, you're always going to have amazing artists. And those artists actually will have some average work, but also having some amazing works as well. So for us, it's about the process that actually really looking backwards and say, in 5 years' time, if we say this is going to be a museum quality fund collection, what does that look like? What's the different chapters within the digital culture era that representing what's the most significant historically and artistically representing that era? And then what is that each chapter should have been about? If it's digital culture, glitch art, generative art, AI art, what is the most representative artist and artwork that fill into each of these categories. And for us, when you're having that, sort of like mentality and approach, I think you're making things a little bit clearer. Definitely not going to make it easier, but it's definitely making the protocol clear. So for us, I think someone like Tyler, we're also a big fan of Dmitri for the Rivers collections. They're definitely up there in terms of the best or one of the best generative artists. I'm also a big fan of Emily Xie personally. I'm collecting a lot of her work. Very, very talented artist. And Refik, obviously, the way he engages AI data has been shown previously about Winds of Yawanawa to really elevating not just a sort of a tribe and a natural sort of scene is really amazing. So, we want to be very, very open-minded, circling back to the previous conversation we said about trying to supporting all of these different genres and really trying to focus about finding the best art and artwork that for each of these genres.
I love that, Matt. Okay, DC, I want to come back to you briefly because we'd be remiss not to talk sort of ETH NFT, ETH ETF, excuse me, and sort of being long ETH in general. Let's frame it up just for a brief conversation around the impact you imagine an ETH future and being very long ETH has on the digital art economy. Does it have some impact on wealth creation that funnels down and back to collecting? Does it onboard net new collectors in some way? Do things get repriced relative to USD? Riff on that for a moment, if you would, DC.
Sure. I think there's a broader story here first of how a second crypto ETF, in addition to the Bitcoin ETF, kind of creates the conditions for what I would call it creates crypto as an asset class. And I think that's insanely valuable and important to the future of crypto and anything that's related to crypto, including NFTs. So I think that is super important and exciting. And to see Ether be that asset, I think is really exciting and speaks to a lot of the qualities of Ether and Ethereum as a network, which we won't go into detail here. But what does it mean for NFTs? Well, I think most NFTs are, of course, still on Ethereum, L1 and L2. And that's not to say they don't exist on other networks, but I think that most of it is still occurring on Ethereum. And so how does an ETF play into possible price action on NFTs? Look, first of all, I'll tell you, I can't tell you for sure, right? I don't know. But I think that the way it will play out is if the Ether ETF is successful, it will create a lot of new capital inflows into Ethereum and into the space as a whole, right? So that's the first thing that we can expect. And as people in the Ethereum ecosystem start to experience those capital flows, and hopefully that manifests as the price of Ether goes higher, right? It does give people more capital to go back and collect some of the things that they felt were important or interesting from an NFT perspective. So I think that is kind of the story that we should keep an eye on. I think in the near term, a lot of people just want exposure to Ether because it's liquid. It's probably going to go up in the face of ETF flows at some point. And yeah, we could see a dump shortly after the launch. There's a lot of ways that this could play out. And I'm not going to try to dissect all of that. But I think the long term is if Ether becomes more important, it becomes more valuable, then people who own it have more wealth. And I think some of that is going to be spent on some of this important art NFTs, right? And I think there's a lot of stuff that is not going to necessarily do well. It's not like everything can benefit from a dynamic like that. But I think the stuff that does benefit well is going to do insanely well. And I think it will start that long-term story of this as something worth collecting for decades, maybe even for centuries, right? That's the way that I look at it.
I appreciate that. I think you described me pretty accurately there because I was looking at both of your collections and feeling extreme pain that I did not have an Autoglyph or Fidenza in my own personal collection. So in a world that you just described, DC, I'm certainly going back and trying to collect those two. Okay, let's transition now to this final segment of the show where we go into both of your vaults to look at one very significant piece or collection. Matt, let's start with you. Excited to hear more about this piece that you've chosen.
Of course, I'm glad to share it. Again, let me share my screen. Do let me know if you guys can see it.
Yep.
So this is a piece that was made by Chris Burden's estate that I have the honor 2 months ago to donate into the LACMA Museum I am deeply honored, obviously, for that donation. And the piece really speaks to me. It's a donation that I did with my wife together, Eva. And she and I, when we first visiting LACMA more than a decade ago, and we first saw the Urban Lights, which is this amazing installations that made by Chris Burden in front of the LACMA, which now become a landmark. It was immediately captivated by Burden's genius to create timeless cityscapes and communicating with performance and installation art. Those 100-year-old historical stream lamps brought us like a profound sense of like romance and peace. And today, that installation and many other Burden's masterpieces already becoming the crown jewel of LACMA and the point of pride for LA, really. So when the opportunity came working with TR Lab and Chris Burden Estate, last year, making this donation possible, this one-of-one Chris Burden's Paso Xanadu to LACMA, I really jump onto it because I think the work itself and the history, and I encourage everybody to read a bit about the background, is that unfinished vision for Chris Burden's blueprint, how his Urban Lights, Metropolis, which is another masterpiece in LACMA Museum, all comes together to create this surreal digital cityscape, which you guys can see on the screen, that all coming together. So I think this just in another way elevates NFT beyond digital native art in a certain way. People normally talk about NFT because they created as NFT to start with. But I think Paso Xanadu shows that NFT can also be used as technology to showcase something which haven't got done before in an unfinished legacy, which is something which I'm really, really proud of to be able to collect.
That's a fantastic selection, Matt. And I want to come back to you just for another moment. Why do you think LACMA, of all the institutions, and of course there are others, why have they been most sort of receptive and open? I mean, perhaps it's because they have this long history of sort of art and technology and that intersection and supporting works at that intersection. But why do you think, from your view, they've been so open-minded about the digital art and NFT ecosystem?
I had a long dinner with Michael Govan, who is their director of LACMA, the other day when I was in LA. And I was really, really impressed by his openness and his forward thinking. So I think museum is in an interesting place where they need to be the stewardship of a legacy of the art history. They're having the responsibility to shape them. And then also art space is a fairly noisy space, as we know, right? There's different forces coming in and having different motivations of putting a work and getting it immortalized in a certain museum. So how to say no to works is a very, very important responsibility for director of museums, especially tier 1 museums like LACMA and many others. But I think even more impressive is knowing all of that hurdle, how to actually take a step forward to say, hey, we think certain emerging art genre will become a historical significant one, and we should lead the charge, letting the world to know how impressive and important they are. That's the reason why I think LACMA is just very much ahead of everybody else, because the leadership really taking that mentality. They understand code. Michael Govan himself is a coder when he was very young. Many of the people may not even know that. I think a lot of this really, really help. And by the conversation, and I can only share part of the contents here, I can assure the audience here that LACMA has a multi-decades long plan from here onward, how to curate, continue to support the digital art space, which I'm personally very excited about. And I'm in London the next couple of weeks, and I'm planning to speaking to some of the other tier 1 museums, and hopefully we'll be able to get more of the institutions in and drive adoption for digital culture.
It's fantastic context, Matt. Appreciate that. And you mentioned TR Labs. We're a big fan of them as well, so want to give them a little shout out. Okay, DC, let's go into your vault. What do you have for us?
Sure. Well, I want to talk a little bit today about autoglyphs as the foundation of on-chain digital generative art. And so I've got my gallery open here and I've got my collection of autoglyphs, but there's one that's really kind of special to me, and that is Autoglyph 135. And there's a long and interesting story behind Autoglyphs, which I won't go into all of today. But one of the fascinating pieces about Autoglyph is it's really generated by code that's on chain, right? And so when the user this work did not exist until the user actually went on chain, interacted with the contract, and the transaction hash provided the source of randomness needed to generate this work. And actually, what you see depicted here, which looks kind of like a QR code or something, right, isn't the actual art that's on chain. And if you go, I've opened up this is not the actual work. I wasn't able to pull it up quickly, but this is an example of an autoglyph and what it actually looks like on chain. And this is from a great piece that Artnoom did several years ago. But this is what an autoglyph actually is, which is ASCII art. Okay, so for someone like me who grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I have a certain affinity for ASCII art, I thought it was just such a cool idea and the use of this technology, this technology Ethereum that I've been really into since like 2016, to use that to create this unique piece of digital art. So this is like what that ASCII art looks like on chain. And then when you interpret it using the instruction that the artists provide and plot it all out, this is kind of what it looks like. The reason why I like this autoglyph so much is because it kind of represents this duality of darkness and lightness. And I kind of view that as like a metaphor for so many things in our lives, but certainly for humanity. And, if you look at any of the autoglyphs, there's a lot of layers to unpack there symbolically, and they're really interesting pieces of art for that reason. So it made even more important by the fact that they were the first on-chain generative art. And in that same vein, as part of the proof collection, which I was fortunate enough to mint one of these. This was, I think, from the first set of proof grails that were released. I have the protoglyph, so this was the artistic vision of what Larva Labs wanted to achieve when they created the autoglyphs. And of course, they were limited by the technology that they could put on chain. But to have a piece of this, and I don't know if people know, but the way these proof mints happened was it wasn't random, but it was like hidden, right? It was like you have to pick from one of like 10 or 20 works, and that's the one that you get. And then later it's revealed who the artists were. My eye was immediately drawn to this one for a multitude of reasons. I had no idea.
I was going to say, did you have some suspicion or no?
Not really, but I would say that it did give me vibes of kind of autoglyphs. And I was like, I like the fractal pattern. It just kind of literally pulled me in. And there was something about it that was very interesting to me. And then when it was revealed, it was the protoglyph, the prototype for the autoglyphs. It kind of made it even more meaningful for me. And I wasn't necessarily surprised when I thought about it in hindsight, but I was like, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. So I'm glad to have that one. And I can't have any discussion about my favorite piece go by without mentioning Punk 294, which was, one of the earlier pieces that I collected. CryptoPunks I think they were not the first NFTs that I bought, because I bought other NFT. I bought CryptoKitties in like 2017, but this is the CryptoPunks were the first NFTs that I really bought to collect. And they weren't, now they kind of have additional social value that's been placed on them. When I bought this punk, it wasn't something cool. It was like kind of like, why are you doing this? A bunch of DeFi people were like, you weirdo, why did you change your profile picture to this punk? And I was like, I just think it's cool. I just thought it was fun. It reminded me of my childhood and the idea of having a digital avatar. I was like, yeah, why not? So I removed my avatar with me wearing a suit and tie, and I CryptoPunk, and I haven't looked back since.
It's so good. Was there already a moment around hoodies, or did you maybe kick that off? Can you take credit for the hoodie movement?
I don't know that I'll fully take credit for it, but I will say there were other people like the hoodies, right? And I would be like, because I remember being in the Punks Discord, I was like, what attributes should I look at? And then people were just like, we like the hoodies. And I was like, oh yeah, they look kind of cool. I can see why. And I kind of like hoodies as well. And I saw this Big Shades one. I actually got into a bit of negotiation with the seller, C Perk. And he wanted 12 ETH. I offered him 10. He's like, I can't. It's a 294, 3-digit. This is as low as I'll go. So I got this for like, I want to say that was about $15,000 at the time. And so this is one that I don't anticipate ever selling for sure.
It's amazing. And Matt, of course, you have a great punks collection as well. This has been an amazing show. So honored to have you both on. Matt, where would you like people to find you, follow you?
I think Twitter will be great, but as Hivemind is growing, we now have presence and office in New York, in London, in Asia. So, I'm actually on the road for the next 6 weeks. Spent 3 weeks in London and then going to Asia before I returning back to New York City, which I'm permanently based. I would just say there's nothing better than always meet in person, actually. Like, despite we all talking about loving about digital art, and I think actually meeting in person and talking about that and appreciating something digital native in person actually is even more meaningful. And New York and London, all these great city, like big city, they have a big artistic community, and hanging out with some of the amazing artists all the time. So I would say just like, hit me up. Like, hopefully if I meet you guys in person, that'll be, even better.
I love that and couldn't agree more. DC, I'm guessing the Twitter is a good spot to find you.
Twitter is a great place to find me. I'm on there just posting a general stream of conscious thoughts. So you get what you pay for, but I enjoy having conversations with people all over the world on a variety of topics.
I love it. And no financial advice, right?
No financial advice or expert opinions or anything else.
All right. Well, this has been such a wonderful show. Thank you, DC. Thank you, Matt. And that's another episode of Vaulted by Proof. See you next week.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.